Hi everybody, welcome to Bookies. I like to review what I read, and one of the last novels I read was Mort by Terry Pratchett, and that's in the fantasy genre, so, I kind of enjoy fantasy. Fantasy is just kind of a nice break from literary fiction and some of the more serious stuff. And, if it's unique and it says something new, fantasy can really be an enjoyable experience for you. So, Mort was published in 1987, and geez, I just graduated high school then. So it's a very old book, and it's the fourth book in the Discworld series. It's the first to focus on the character Death. And kind of the interesting thing here, Mort is actually French for death, so you get a little play on words in the title there, but for the most part, I'm going to say about 60-40, this novel is about Mort and not about Death. Mort is Death's apprentice. We find in the novel that Mort doesn't really have the personality and temperament to work on a farm. He's completely unsuited to it. In realizing this, that Mort's just completely worthless when it comes to farm work, his dad takes him to a job fair in the hopes that he could get an apprenticeship for his son. And it comes close to midnight, and most everybody else has been apprenticed, and there's sitting Mort. But fortunately, just by the stroke of midnight, Death arrives looking for an apprentice, and Mort is apprenticed to Death. So what do you do when you get an apprentice? Most people, if they got an apprentice, would teach him the job. And except Death is having, I don't think you can call it a midlife crisis, because he doesn't really have a life because he's deaf. But he just wants to do something different. And so Death goes out and lives what he thinks are the primary joyful experiences of being human. That involves drinking, dancing, gambling, and even working a job. But while this is happening, what happens is Mort kind of has to do some reaping all on his own. So he's out there reaping some souls, and Death took him on a dry run, so to speak, to go reap a couple souls. And he was giving Mort the lay of the land, and he was impressing upon Mort that you should not interfere with death. Death is predestined for all people, and you just shouldn't interfere with that as the personification of death. Death impresses upon Mort that he must learn compassion. And what compassion is from the perspective of Death is a sharp blade. It's the blade that severs the soul from the body. That's compassion. Do your job well, Mort. That is exercising compassion. However, do you think Mort does that? Does he really pay attention? Well, that's for the plot of the novel, and I'm not going to disclose that, but I will say that there's some really interesting plot points. For example, what happens when an individual is predestined to die and then that doesn't happen for whatever reason? People think you're dead even though you're not really dead, and so Pratchett creates this kind of alternate universe in which the people that are supposed to be dead but aren't dead have to continually try to convince people that they're not dead. And even if that means hiring somebody to go around and remind people that this person's not actually dead. It's actually a really creative device. I have to give Pratchett a lot of credit for that. Because people are just walking by the supposedly dead person because they expect that person to be dead, and the dead person's basically saying, hey, I'm right here, and I hired this guy to remind you that I'm right here. Very funny. So that's a really enjoyable part of the novel. What I'd like to do is tell you some of the things I liked about the novel and then some of the things I didn't like. And the first thing I liked is Pratchett is very funny. It's been a while since I read a novel where I was kind of chuckling to myself. Death is serious, except, which is quite suitable for his work, except kind of mocking Death is kind of funny. So, for example, Death doesn't care if people are good or bad. He just cares that they're punctual and that they're nice to cats. Funny. Death is seeking a job, because he's having this quote unquote midlife crisis. And so he goes to an individual, a job broker, somebody that can help him get a job, and they're discussing Death's qualifications. And he says, well, basically, I can walk through walls, and I'm an anthropomorphic personification of death. And so the job broker basically says, well, I don't really think that qualifies you for anything. Have you ever thought about going into teaching? I was a lawyer, so usually people are picking on my profession, but this one directed towards teachers. So, quite humorous, and I really liked that about the novel. The other thing I really liked is, and this is something that I think really plagues the fantasy genre. I've always thought this ever since I was a kid, and I was 6 years old reading fantasy novels. There aren't enough standalone novels in the fantasy genre. I find that you could pick up a novel and it's 1,100 pages long, and when it concludes, nothing's really happened, and you feel like you just read a chapter in a 50,000 page novel. The good thing about Mort is it stands alone. You don't have to read any of the other Discworld novels to understand this. No background is required. It just stands alone by itself, and I really like that. The other thing I really like about it is that it avoids all the fantasy tropes that you see out there. So there's no great quest. There's no magical artifact that gives powers to its wielder. There's no damsels in distress, no foreshadowed prophecies, no Dark Lord, and for God's sake, no dragons. So all of that's avoided here, and it's quite unique, and I love that. I don't have a problem with fantasy tropes per se. After all, the Lord of the Rings literally created every single one of these. If you combine the Lord of the Rings and the Hobbit, Tolkien created every fantasy trope. And it's just shocking. I mean, decades ago, Tolkien wrote those novels. And those same tropes are just being played over and over again. Mort avoids that, and I love that. And here's what I didn't like. There was an interview of Pratchett in 2004, and he basically said that this was the first novel in the Discworld series that he actually liked. So it's the fourth one. So I guess he didn't really appreciate or like his first three that much, because he criticized them, and he said, well, those were usually just kind of props to support a joke. And he says that with this novel, with Mort, that the plot was integral. I kind of disagree. The plot itself is pretty average. And I really do think the strength of the book is the humor. The plot's kind of vanilla. So maybe I can explain to you by analogy what I mean by that. Remember when you were a kid at Christmas and you were so excited to open up presents, and then you opened up some presents, and here's this present, and you're excited, and you find out that it's clothes and maybe even socks. Yeah, that's kind of how the plot landed for me. You're kind of excited, and then it's just kind of like, oh, it's this. Okay. So maybe another analogy will help, because I grew up kind of poor, somewhat poor, and I knew what my parents were doing by buying me clothes. They were basically trying to net zero out the holidays. They had to kind of buy me clothes because I was growing like 3 or 4 inches every year. So, I mean, when your pants start to look like shorts, that's not a good thing. So I knew what they were doing there. So I get it. I mean, if you grew up with money, or, middle class or whatever, maybe that analogy doesn't hit home. So let's try this one. Do you remember the Black Eyed Peas, the band? There was this guy on there, one of the founding members, mind you, and his name, they gave him a name, Taboo. And, well, here he is. Boop, 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 right there, Taboo. Taboo kind of doesn't do anything. He just kind of runs around on stage and pumps his fists and says, yo, and yeah, and stuff like that. I mean, it's just, he's kind of a nothing. So, yeah, that's kind of how the plot was. To balance it out, weighing the good against the bad, I'm going to give this about 3.25 stars. So it's just a little bit above average. You can pick up this novel and not pay full price for it. Absolutely read it. It's humorous and, it's fairly short. So it's a day or two and you'll definitely get your money's worth. That being said, don't expect a lot of bells and whistles when it comes to the plot. So the bottom line is, if you can get it cheap, buy it. It'll be worth it. Don't pay full price for it, because you save that money and go read a book that's really going to be a page turner for you. That would be my recommendation to you. With that, I'm going to encourage you to like and subscribe. I know fantasy is kind of a little bit different than what I've been doing on this channel. And so, but like I said, I'm going to review what I read. So if you like the content, please like and subscribe. I really appreciate it. And with that, have a great day and God bless.